Let's be clear about something before we go any further, because when most people imagine repression, they picture violence, soldiers in the streets, roadblocks, curfews, and a show of force that announces itself loudly and leaves no room for doubt. But the most effective form of control in the modern world looks like a decision made by one man, sitting far from the streets it will affect. A decision rooted in the understanding that you no longer need to dominate people physically if you can disconnect them quietly, letting silence spread so smoothly that at first it barely feels intentional. In this case, it arrived suddenly. Entire regions lost access to the internet overnight, mobile networks went dark, digital payments froze in place, and information simply stopped moving, not because it was censored or deleted, but because it could no longer travel. Officially, this was described as a temporary security measure, a technical necessity, a short-term response to unrest. And if it had happened once, that explanation might have held, but it didn't happen once. It happened again, and then again, and then again, each time lasting longer and covering wider areas. What you're about to see is not a country losing control. It's a leader discovering something more efficient than force, the realization that if you control connectivity, you don't have to control people directly, because people begin to regulate themselves. It shows that once a man in power learns he can shut down reality without triggering sanctions, without inviting invasion, and without provoking global outrage, that knowledge doesn't stay theoretical. So, before we talk about where this happened or why the world once applauded him as a symbol of peace, you need to understand the system he chose to use. This isn't just a story about a nation going dark. It's the story of how one man proved that modern power doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to access the switch. Welcome to Empire Secrets. Before the shutdowns, before the silence, before the switches were ever pulled, there was a moment when the world genuinely believed it was watching a success story unfold. In 2019, the international press moved almost in unison, headlines turning optimistic overnight, diplomats expressing relief, and Western leaders eager to believe that something rare had finally happened. After years of repression and stagnation, a reformer had arrived, a man who promised reconciliation instead of force, openness instead of isolation, and peace in a country long defined by division. Political prisoners were released, exiles were invited home, borders reopened, and former enemies were photographed shaking hands, creating the impression that the country had reached a turning point. That year, the world's most powerful moral endorsement was applied, not quietly or cautiously, but decisively, the Nobel Peace Prize. The man receiving it was Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, a country being marketed at the time as a pivotal point for Africa's future. With a population of more than 100 million, a fast-growing economy, and a strategic role in a volatile region, Abiy Ahmed was framed as the hinge on which that future would turn, a leader who spoke the language of unity, quoted philosophy, and promised modernization without bloodshed. To the outside world, he looked like the embodiment of progress, calm, articulate, and reassuringly modern. But there was a detail that rarely entered that conversation. Ethiopia was not just a country undergoing reform. It was also an infrastructure experiment. It didn't happen everywhere at once, because that would have been too obvious, too loud, too visible. Instead, it happened selectively, first in one region, then another, then across entire provinces, until the rest of the country appeared to function normally. Phones still showed full bars, but nothing moved. Messages never arrived. Mobile payments failed without explanation. News sites timed out. Social media didn't load, not because it had been blocked, but because it no longer existed on the other side of the screen. Each shutdown aligned with moments when visibility mattered most, when troops were moving, protests were gathering, and information could have turned momentum into pressure. There was no global backlash, no dramatic footage forcing intervention, just a country that continued to function on the surface while large parts of its population were quietly cut off from the rest of the world. And once a government realizes it can rule through disconnection, the temptation to repeat it becomes irresistible, and Ethiopia was only the beginning. The shutdown was not improvised. The switch didn't appear in the moment, and it wasn't invented when unrest began. It had been sitting there for years. On the surface, Ethiopia's digital system looked like a success story of modernization. Mobile banking expanded rapidly, national ID programs were rolled out, biometric registration became normal, and everyday economic life was increasingly tied to phones and data. It looked like progress, the kind international institutions like to fund and praise. But beneath that polish sat a structure almost no one questioned. Ethiopia's entire telecommunications backbone ran through a single state-controlled provider, Ethio Telecom, which meant that calls, messages, transactions, and every packet of data entering or leaving the country moved through infrastructure the state already owned. This wasn't framed as danger. It was framed as efficiency, as sovereignty, as development. Connectivity expanded, coverage improved, and millions of citizens came online for the first time. What most people failed to notice was what that centralization made possible. In most countries, shutting down the internet is like trying to stop traffic in a city with thousands of roads. You can slow movement, block intersections, and cause disruption, but silencing everything at once is nearly impossible. In Ethiopia, it was different. There weren't thousands of roads. There was, effectively, a single highway. When protests spread, the response wasn't soldiers first or visible force. It was silence. Data routes were throttled, mobile services disabled, and entire regions were digitally isolated. Ethiopia still looked functional. Government statements continued and official channels stayed active, but on the ground, people were suddenly alone. Violence doesn't need secrecy to be condemned, but it does need visibility. Protests don't collapse because people are afraid, they collapse because people can no longer see each other. This wasn't about blocking websites or censoring content, it was about breaking shared reality. And here's the most dangerous part. The shutdowns weren't permanent. They were temporary, strategic, and reversible, which meant they didn't feel like tyranny. They felt like maintenance. A few days offline, then partial restoration, just enough normality to avoid panic and just enough disruption to regain control. And once that lesson is learned by one state, especially under the authority of a single leader willing to normalize its use, it doesn't stay local. It becomes an option, and options, once proven effective, tend to travel. The moment this stopped being theoretical could be traced precisely. In June 2019, Ethiopia experienced its first nationwide internet shutdown under Abiy Ahmed, following a failed coup attempt in the Amhara region. Connectivity was cut across the country for days, not selectively explained and not transparently reviewed, but broadly justified as a security necessity. At the time, it was treated as an exception, an extraordinary response to an extraordinary event. What followed made that framing harder to defend. In July 2020, after the killing of the popular Oromo singer, Hachalu Hundessa triggered widespread protests. The internet was shut down again, this time for nearly 3 weeks. Mobile data, fixed broadband, and digital services were interrupted across large parts of the country, coinciding with mass arrests and security operations. Information moved slowly, verification became impossible, and international reporting thinned as access narrowed. Once more, the disruption ended quietly, without inquiry, without consequence. By November 2020, during the outbreak of the conflict in Tigray, the shutdowns became fully integrated into state response. Internet and telecommunications were cut almost entirely in the region as military operations began, preventing independent reporting, obstructing humanitarian coordination, and isolating millions of civilians from the outside world. In August 2019, India imposed a sweeping communications blackout in Jammu and Kashmir following the revocation of the region's special status, cutting mobile networks and internet access for months. In November of the same year, Iran shut down the internet nationwide during fuel price protests, an interruption so complete that global traffic monitors recorded a near-total disappearance of Iranian connectivity within hours. So guys, you see what's happening here. Shutdowns were not imposed after control was lost. They were imposed to prevent visibility while control was being asserted. In Ethiopia, the authority to disconnect rested with a single executive center, and the choice to use that authority repeatedly transformed a capability into policy. Other governments did not follow because of speeches or doctrine. They followed because the evidence was visible. Connectivity could be removed during moments of tension without triggering decisive retaliation from outside. And that leaves an unresolved question. If this pattern is now documented, dated and visible, why does it continue? Why do institutions built to defend openness respond cautiously when connectivity disappears? And why does the absence of immediate consequence still outweigh the long-term cost? By the time Ethiopia's shutdowns became impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents, the international response had already settled into a pattern. Statements were issued, concerns were noted, and language was carefully calibrated to avoid escalation. What was striking was not the absence of reaction, but its consistency. When communications were cut, official responses rarely addressed the decision itself. Instead, they circled around it. Phrases like urging restraint, calling for calm, and encouraging dialogue dominated diplomatic messaging, while the act of disconnecting millions of people from information, finance, and coordination was treated as a secondary detail, often buried deep in longer statements. Over time, the language narrowed further. References to restored access appeared only after the fact, once services had already returned, turning each blackout into a closed episode rather than an open issue. There were no demands for criteria, no calls for oversight, and no expectation of review. Silence was treated as self-correcting. Throughout this period, engagement with Abiy Ahmed continued uninterrupted. He remained a central interlocutor in regional security decisions, a recipient of development funding and a partner in diplomatic initiatives. The contradiction between his international standing and the repeated use of shutdowns was rarely addressed directly, and never pressed to the point of consequence. Even the institutions most closely associated with openness and information access framed the issue cautiously. Statements from bodies such as the United Nations and the European Union focused on humanitarian access and de-escalation, with connectivity mentioned as a logistical concern rather than a governing practice that reshaped civilian life. The absence of deadlines, the lack of follow-up, the decision to not press further once stability appeared to return, these were not oversights, they were choices. And those choices shaped behavior. Because for the leader already willing to use connectivity as a governing tool, the world's response sent a clear message. It said that as long as shutdowns were framed as temporary and security-driven, they would not fundamentally alter diplomatic standing or international cooperation. Once that understanding settled in, it no longer required explanation. It simply became part of the calculation. Right now, it's tempting to blame the system itself, to argue that once infrastructure exists, it inevitably gets used, or that centralization makes outcomes unavoidable. But that's not how power actually operates. In Ethiopia, every nationwide shutdown, every regional blackout, every selective interruption of connectivity required authorization, not through public declarations or formal decrees, but through a chain of decisions that consistently led back to the same center of authority. There was never real ambiguity about where that authority sat. Telecommunications was state-owned, gateways were centralized, and emergency powers were consolidated at the top, which meant that when the signal dropped, it wasn't the product of chaos or technical failure, but of approval, and that approval belonged to Abiy Ahmed. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because Abiy Ahmed did not rise to power promising control. He arrived speaking the language of openness, reconciliation, and restraint, presenting himself as a leader who could modernize Ethiopia without repeating the violence of its past. That promise is precisely why the world embraced him so quickly, why the Nobel Committee acted when it did, and why international institutions extended patience long after contradictions began to surface. But power changes the function of tools. What begins as an emergency response slowly acquires a different meaning once it proves effective. When a leader sees that cutting connectivity can disperse protests without confrontation, isolate regions without deploying troops, and reduce visibility without triggering immediate consequences, that action stops being exceptional and becomes available. And once it becomes available, choosing not to use it requires restraint rather than necessity. Over time, the shutdowns became more deliberate, aligning closely with moments when information could alter outcomes. Whether during security operations, political unrest, or periods of heightened scrutiny, they were framed as temporary, restored just quickly enough to maintain plausible deniability, and repeated often enough that what once felt extraordinary began to feel procedural. This was not the behavior of a state losing control, but of a leadership observing results and refining a method. What often gets lost in simplified accounts is that Abiy Ahmed did not need to invent this mechanism. He inherited the infrastructure. But inheritance does not absolve choice. At every critical moment, the question was never whether the switch existed, but whether it would be used, and repeatedly, that decision was made in the affirmative. At some point while working on this, I stopped thinking about it as a political story, because none of this depends on ideology. It's just a pattern you start to recognize once you've seen it enough times. Access narrows, noise drops, people adapt, and life carries on in a quieter version of itself. Not because anyone agreed to it, but because adjustment is easier than resistance when the change arrives without drama. So when you watch it happen at the level of a state, it doesn't feel shocking. It feels scaled up, like it's familiar but just bigger. And this is where the story opens outward. Ethiopia is not the most extreme example of power ruling through darkness. It is the visible one, the documented one, the case where silence was tested, refined, and tolerated. Beyond it lies something more deliberate, more entrenched, and far harder to observe. Nearby, another place learned to take this logic further, not by temporarily disconnecting its population, but by vanishing almost entirely from the map, hiding extraction, trade, and entire economies in the dark. Here, silence stops being a tactic and becomes an architecture. And you need to look at what happens when a nation builds its power inside the blackout itself. Next story doesn't begin with a shutdown, it begins with a country that disappears every night. Tap the video on screen now, and we'll see you on the other side. Your desire, your empire.